First up, we have Shan'do Wildclaw, 3 mana 3/3. Choose one, give beasts in your deck +1/+1, or transform into a copy of a friendly beast. And this card is available to both hunters and druids. So the first effect on this is basically like a delayed Keleseth, but just for beasts. We know Keleseth is a great card, so that's a powerful effect. And the second effect on this is just a Faceless Manipulator, discounted by 2 mana, but again specific to beasts. So power level of this card, very high, but my concern is finding a home for this card. So if we start with Druid, the top Druid deck right now obviously is some sort of Spell Druid, which currently plays no beasts, and obviously since we're a Spell Druid deck, we can't just jam beasts in our Glowfly Swarm Fungal Fortunes deck. So it looks like this is probably going to be a newer Druid deck. But when we search for Beast, Druid really just doesn't have that much to play around with. Only 4 class beasts, and when we start looking at neutrals, like, yeah, there's some playable stuff, but nothing that's really making me want to build a deck around this card. So I don't think this card is going to be too strong in Druid. You can maybe play it in Ramp Druid, just as a 3 mana Faceless Manipulator for Winged Guardian and Marsh Hydra, but I think that's a bit too situational. So with the current card pool, I think this card's probably not that good in Druid. But it does have some more potential in Hunter. Again though, the current archetypes of Hunter don't really support this that well. The most popular archetype currently is Highlander Hunter, which as of right now only plays 2 beasts. And it kind of likes playing few beasts, because it makes your Scavenger's Ingenuity more consistent. You could of course just jam some more beasts in the deck at the expense of the Scavenger's Ingenuity, but you'd really have to be shoving quite a few beasts in the deck to make it worth playing Shan'do Wildclaw, I think. Now, compared to Druid, Shan'do is better in Hunter because you can play it in the same turn as Dino Tamer Bran for 2 King Crushes on turn 10, which is obviously a lot of damage. But I don't think that synergy on its own is enough to include a 3 mana 3/3 in your Hunter deck. And when we look at the other popular Hunter decks, there's like Face Hunter, which does play a few beasts, but not enough to really support Shan'do, and you don't want to like be copying a Phase Stalker for 3 mana. Or there's also like Dragon Hunter, which doesn't play any beasts as far as I know. So I don't think Shan'do is sliding into any current Hunter decks, but unlike Druid, I do think there's some potential for this to build a new deck. We got this hand buff beast archetype in Ashes of Outland, with like Hellboar, Augmented Porcupine is kind of the highlight of that, Machnathal Lion as well. And then of course there's just some other good beasts that Hunter has access to, you know, Shimmerfly, Phase Stalker. If you're playing Phase Stalker, you can play like Hyena Alpha as well. So it's possible that Beast Hunter could be a thing. And in that deck, like none of the stuff I listed is a particularly good copy target for your Shan'do. But that's just a mid-range deck that can play Keleseth, basically. And we know how powerful Keleseth was. So I think there's... So if Shan'do's going to be seeing any play, I think it's probably going to be in a deck like that. And I think Shan'do is certainly a powerful enough card that it makes building that archetype interesting. And if it gets any more support, I could absolutely see it being a real deck. Next up we have Wand Thief, 1 mana 1/2 combo, discover a mage spell. This is available to both mage and rogue. So this is kind of similar to the Shan'do, in the sense that in a vacuum it's just a powerful card, but I think this is more likely to just slot into existing archetypes. As far as mage goes, I could see this possibly just going in Highlander Mage. This archetype typically isn't really that happy to be playing cheap cards, but it's a cheap card that can potentially make expensive cards. And if this deck is already playing like Transfer Student, I think you can probably make the room for a card like Wand Thief. One reservation I have in a deck like Highlander Mage is that a lot of times you're just curving out, you know, like turn 4 is 4 drop, turn 5 is 5 drop, turn 7 is 7 drop. But I do think that Wand Thief is just like so easy to fit into the curve that I think you're certainly happy at least trying it out. And it can give you like your cheap removal spell that you need, or it can give you your big giant spells that you can later play for free with, you know, your Dragon Caster, your Caligos, or whatever. So cheap or expensive, whatever you get off the Wand Thief, I think is pretty usable in Highlander Mage. It also seems like this expansion might be pushing a Cyclone Mage, and I think if a Cyclone Mage is going to exist, then Wand Thief is certainly a card that could go in there. It seems like that archetype would really like having extra copies of like Ray of Frost, or Magic Trick, or just any cheap spells really. So I think Wand Thief could fit in multiple mage archetypes. But it's probably even more interesting of a card in Rogue. I think it could possibly just slot into current Galakrond Rogue lists. It's a little bit awkward as another 1-drop because Rogue already has a pretty good handful of really cheap cards it's playing. But since Wand Thief is a combo card, I don't know that it really competes with Pharaoh Cat or Spy Mistress necessarily. More so it's just like a pretty good card that you're playing, you know, turn 4 or something. And in a pinch it is cheap enough that you can just play it as like an activator for Edwin or Evil Miscreant or something and still be pretty happy with it. So I think a deck like this it could certainly just slot into, but it might do even more than that. It does give you a mage spell, so it can activate something like Bizarre Burglary, which is maybe a little bit ambitious, but more realistically, it is support for Underbelly Fence and Vendetta. Currently the Galakrond Rogue builds are either stealth or secret focused. I think it's possible that with Wand Thief, the decks start being more Vendetta focused, because it's, what, probably just the best activator for Vendetta in Standard right now, and you can still play Hinge Clan Burglar, and maybe like a Pilfer or something, a Dragon Sword, I guess. So yeah, Wand Thief I think just looks pretty powerful, and might even be a card that shifts rogue decks somewhat. Next we have Rattlegore, 9 mana 9/9, Death Rattle, resummon this with -1/-1. And then of course, when this comes out as an 8/8, it has a Death Rattle that makes it a 7/7 and then a 6/6. So basically, it's a 9 mana 45/45 OP. But the thing is, it's like pretty hard to ever play this card. Like a lot of games, obviously, you're pretty dead on turn 9. And even in the games where you're not dead on turn 9, you play your 9-drop and it just gets hexed or whatever. That's pretty sad. So, even though there's like a lot of value packed into this card, I don't think it has a home currently, and I kind of am skeptical that it's going to have a home at all. Currently, the slowest warrior deck is this like bomb control warrior thing, and it does have some pretty expensive stuff: Bronx, Galakrond, Blastmaster Boom, Deathwing. But like even in this deck, I think the Rattlegore is just like way too slow. It seems like what they're pushing with Rattlegore is going to be the Dimensional Ripper archetype. And if you do hit 2 of these off Dimensional Ripper, I mean, they are pretty sticky. And if you're up against, you know, Galakrond Priest, then that's probably a very powerful play. Unless they play Soul Mirror, and then you're just very sad. But it is pretty powerful. The thing is, though, is that going to be, like, the best way to build Warrior in this next expansion? I'm going to say probably not. And even in the Dimensional Ripper deck, I think a lot of times I'd rather just hit Scrapyard Colossus than Rattlegore. So this card I'm not too impressed with overall. Now, a card I am pretty impressed by is this Druid spell, Nature Studies. 1 mana, discover a spell, your next one costs 1 less. So this compares to like Primordial Glyph and Haunting Visions, both of which, well, Primordial Glyph saw a ton of play, Haunting Visions saw a surprising amount of play as well. But I think this is maybe even better, because for 1, it's just more efficient at 1 mana. And 2, Druid currently just has so many insane spells that can make or break your early game. Nature Studies is giving you more opportunities to pick up early Overgrowth, early Breath of Dreams, early Wild Growth as well. Depending on what you're playing, an early Embiggen can be insane, and early Strengthened numbers can win the game. Even being more reliable and picking up early Glowfly Swarms or Fungal Fortunes can be pretty important. And this card, of course, also has synergy with those because it's a good spell that you can put in your Fungal Fortunes deck. And every spell you can put in that deck obviously makes it better. Especially when we're already playing garbage like Claw and Moonfire, I think Nature Studies is looking pretty damn good. And then of course, Nature Studies also has synergy with Exotic Mount Seller. You can either play it the turn before to give yourself like a 0 mana crystal power or something, or if you have enough mana, you just play it on the turn of, and it's a cheap activator for the Mount Seller that probably gives you another cheap activator. So yeah, Nature Studies just seems pretty insanely strong in any Spell Druid archetype, and it's just an efficient enough card that there's probably a good chance it sees play in other Druid archetypes as well. It's just not much of a mana investment. So I have to imagine this card is going to see a ton of play if Druid sees pretty much any amount of play. Next we have Wretched Tutor, 4 mana 2/5, Spell Burst, deal 2 damage to all other minions. And the way Spell Burst works is the first time you cast a spell after summoning this card, then the Spell Burst effect goes off. So you can be playing like Rogue, you play 4 mana 2/5, you backstab something, and then it also deals 2 damage AoE to the whole board. Or you can put it in Druid, turn 4 you play this and then Innervate with it, or Moonfire with it. It seems like pretty much every class has a reasonably cheap activator for this card, and neutral AoE that is at least playable to some extent in every class has to see play somewhere eventually, right? And like 4 mana 2/5 is a fine stat line. We know from Consecration and Holy Nova that 2 damage on a 4 mana AoE is fine, so I have to imagine this card is going to see play somewhere. I'm not sure if it would slot into any current decks. Like, it seems like the kind of card that maybe a Highlander Mage type of deck would play, but Highlander Mage doesn't really currently play the spells to support it, although it certainly could. You could just jam, like, Ancient Mysteries in this deck. You could play Magic Trick or something. But I don't know if it specifically goes in Highlander Mage, but certainly that sort of deck would be interested in this card. And since it can be played in 10 classes, I have to imagine that it's going to see at least some amount of play. Next we have Transfer Student. I don't really want to talk too much about the power level of this card because it's already in the game, and people are already playing it in decks, so we already know it's good. But I will just say that I really like the design of this card. It's randomness that makes your games different, like game to game. It makes things feel different. But within the game, it's not really random at all. It's very predictable what the card's going to do, so both players can play with that in mind. So I really like that type of randomness. It's just unfortunate that there's like so much information packed into this card, because it's kind of hard to, like, even if you should know what it's going to do, it's kind of hard to always actually know what it's going to do. And it would be really hard to apply this type of effect to a bunch of different cards because there's just so much information you'd have to remember if there were like 4 cards that changed based on the boards or something like that. But I do really like the way that this... I really think this is like a good randomness card that feels good to have in the game. Next we have Diligent Notetaker, 2 mana 2/3, Spell Burst, return the spell to your hand. This is a Shaman card. So this card is obviously just very efficient. It's a River Croc with upside, and the upside is pretty damn good. It's basically draw a card under the right circumstances. But it's targeted draw a card. So if you're playing like Control Shaman, you can play this on turn 5 with a Lightning Storm, you get another Lightning Storm back. Or Serpent Shrine Portal, you get another Serpent Shrine Portal back. Both of those things are pretty powerful, I would say. On top of just being a pretty efficient card, it is a 2-drop in Shaman, and Shaman doesn't necessarily have the best 2s. We've seen that even fairly recently, decks with like 4 Murlocs were playing Underbelly Angler. So I think Diligent Notetaker is certainly a just a powerful card because it's a good Shaman 2-drop. Currently, the best Shaman deck is Totem Shaman, and it seems like Diligent Notetaker could even fit into that deck. You can really pump out some stats with Totemic Might or Totemic Surge. For 2 mana, you get a 2/3 and give all your totems like +4 attack or something. That's pretty nice. It's very strong with Storm's Wrath. If your opponent's not careful, it can even do some pretty ridiculous stuff with Bloodlust, or depending on your build, maybe even Lava Burst. So it definitely seems like an efficient card on its own. It can fit control archetypes, it can fit aggro archetypes, so it seems just like a good card. And on top of that, we're going to see, I think it's called Lightning Bloom later. This card is insane with that. So I think Diligent Notetaker is just a good Shaman card. If there's a good Shaman deck, if there's a playable Shaman deck, this card is probably going to be a 2 of in it. Next we have Goody Two-Shields, 3 mana 4/2 Divine Shield. Spell Burst, gain Divine Shield. So I'm not necessarily sure how good the Spell Burst is on this, because if you're playing a Divine Shield minion, a lot of times it's dying because your opponent is pinging off the Divine Shield and then killing it. And since this only has 2 health, it's not that hard to just kill this after getting rid of the Divine Shield. But I think that's kind of fine. Even if you just ignore the Spell Burst on this card, 3 mana 4/2 Divine Shield is pretty good. I mean, I know Scarlet Crusader doesn't actually see any play, but this is basically just an existing card with +1/+1, even if we ignore the Spell Burst. So that's got to be pretty powerful. And realistically, any new Paladin card that's not just garbage is a huge buff to Pure Paladin, which apparently is actually a real deck right now. And even as a real deck, it sure plays some stinky cards like Bronze Explorer. So I think at the very least, this card just probably slots into Pure Paladin and you're quite happy with it, even if you never Spell Burst it. Outside of Pure Paladin, I think the best Paladin deck right now is Murloc Paladin. And I actually think this card might even just be efficient enough for Murloc Paladin, even though that deck probably plays 0 spells. Just as a Divine Shield minion, it's pretty good. Now, unfortunately for this card, Divine Shields are currently probably the worst they've been in a while, with Demon Hunter being introduced to the game, and like every warrior deck playing Risky Skipper. Divine Shields are pretty vulnerable, but I've said it several times, I think this card is just efficient enough to see play. Next we have Cult Neophyte, 2 mana 3/2 Battlecry. Your opponent's spells cost 1 more next turn. So Bloodfin Raptor with upside. It's a bit of an awkward card, because it's not always easy to tell when this disruption effect is going to be that impactful. And if you're trying to disrupt a specific card, making it cost 1 more mana is not necessarily that disruptive for the opponent. Because, like, if you're trying to stop your opponent's board clear going into turn 6 and you play this, they can still just brawl you. They can just pay 6 mana for their brawl or whatever. But I do think there's a lot of potential here to like specifically disrupt, say, Breath of the Infinite on turn 3 or something like that. And usually just delaying a board clear by a single turn is going to be good enough for some sort of zoo type deck to get there. There's also the possibility that something like Cyclone Mage takes off. I definitely think Cyclone Mage is getting some support in this set. And if you're, you know, making your opponents like 7 spells, each cost 1 more, that's obviously pretty insane. But I think for the most part, this is probably not going to be like some weird control tech against specific decks. I think it's a zoo card, and you're going to be using it specifically to dodge certain removal. And it might be good enough. I do think, like, even if this card is pretty powerful, a lot of aggro decks nowadays are very synergy based. And like, this doesn't have, you know, discard synergy for zoo or something. It doesn't work with Magic Carpet. It doesn't really work with like Totem Shaman or whatever. I can't really see Demon Hunter making room for a card like this. Although I guess Demon Hunter does play some pretty sketchy neutral cards already, so maybe this could be a home for it. It's certainly a powerful enough card to see play, I think, but mostly in aggressive decks. I don't think you're, like, teching this in your Control Priest or whatever the way you would in Acidic Swamp Ooze. Alright, next we have Lightning Bloom. I did reference this card earlier with the Shaman 2-drop. This is a 0 mana spell, gain 2 mana crystals this turn only, overload 2. So a Druid and Shaman card. It's basically pre-nerf Innervate with overload 2. And I think overload 2 on old Innervate still makes it a pretty insane card. I talked a bit with Nature Studies about how powerful that is with the Spell Druid archetype, and this of course is quite good in that deck as well. It lets you make more beasts off your Mount Seller, lets you play your Mount Seller early. If you don't have Mount Seller, you can just play Ysera instead. You can Innervate out your Overgrowth early. There's just so much that you can do with 2 extra mana in a turn. But this also has applications in Druid decks outside of Spell Druid. I don't know that an Embiggen Druid would necessarily play this, because you kind of already have to play like a couple ramp cards. You have to play the side quest, and every spell you put in that deck makes your Embiggen worse. But honestly, this card is probably just good enough for that deck if it exists. And I think if there's like a big ramp Druid, this card is good enough for that deck as well. Playing a Winged Guardian on turn 5 can just win certain matchups. It certainly makes it easier to put something like a Scrapyard Colossus in your deck. If you're trying to Overgrowth into that, you can just play your Scrapyard Colossus on turn 8 instead of turn 10. Or with Overgrowth, what is that, like turn 6 or whatever? So yeah, multiple archetypes of Druid this could definitely see play in. And of course, I think it's probably fairly likely to see play in Shaman as well. It's a little bit sketchier in Shaman just in general, because Shaman decks tend to be like, if you're a control deck, then like this card isn't really value, right? It's a tempo card. And I don't know if that's necessarily good for a lot of the control shamans that have existed. But it probably could see some play in something like Totem Shaman. So one specific interaction in Totem Shaman is you hero power on 2 and they kill your totem, which normally makes your Totemic Reflection unplayable. But if you have Lightning Bloom, you can just hero power or play an evil totem and then just Totemic Reflect it on turn 3 anyway. Or hell, you could turn 1 double Lightning Bloom, hero power Totemic Reflection, right? That's pretty insane. It can let you, like, turn 6 Serpent Shrine Portal plus Bloodlust for a finisher. So just very insane card. And of course I mentioned the 2-drop earlier. The Diligent Notetaker. So the Diligent Notetaker, you can go like turn 1, coin Diligent Notetaker, double Lightning Bloom, and then play like a 4-drop. I think the nastiest 4-drop I've seen is Squall Hunter, which you don't really care about the overload from it because you're already overloaded for 1,000,000 anyway. So yeah, turn 1 a 2/3 and a 5/7 with spell damage plus 2. That's a pretty insane turn that you could possibly do if you draw the absolute nuts with these cards. So yeah, Lightning Bloom, we know how good Old Innervate was, and since it's a tempo card, I don't think the overload 2 on it is that big of a deal. But certainly overloading is a drawback, so it's not as good as Old Innervate. But it can be played in twice as many classes as Old Innervate, so certainly a card to keep an eye out for. Next we have Devolving Missiles. This is a mage/shaman card. 1 mana, shoot 3 missiles at random enemy minions that transform them into ones that cost 1 less. Definitely seems like a powerful card to me. We know that Devolve was a powerful card, and I think situationally this is better than Devolve. Costs half as much mana as Devolve. And I believe this can multi-hit the missiles on single minions. So if your opponent has, you know, Tyrion or whatever, you can turn their Tyrion into a 5-drop, I believe. Just based on the way the card's worded, I think it works like that. But it is going to be pretty frustrating when your opponent has, you know, 3 Tyrions in play, and you turn one of them into a 5-drop and your opponent still has 2 Tyrions. But overall, I still think the card is pretty strong. Mostly just because it costs so little mana. 1 mana for this effect is just extremely efficient, I think. And it's efficient enough that I think even in the early mid-game, like turn 4 or whatever, If you're just evolving like a Frozen Shadow Weaver and a Battle Fiend and something else, I think you're just like pretty happy if you're hitting all of those, even if you don't have the full board clear to go along with it. And of course, as a mage spell, there's potentially like Sorcerer's Apprentice, Mana Cyclone synergies, so certainly some upside there in that kind of archetype. But I think you probably even just jam it into Highlander Mage, because it's an efficient enough removal card. If there's any sort of control shaman, that deck probably plays this as well. Might even just be a better card than Hex. And I think like even Totem Shaman could play this. I mean, aggro decks have played Devolve to get through taunts, and Devolving Missiles is just pretty reasonable at doing that as well. It's pretty common to be playing an aggressive deck like this, and as soon as your opponent plays like a Winged Guardian, you just lose the game. But not with Devolving Missiles. So certainly a sketchy card, certainly a high variance card, but I think at 1 mana it's just too good to not see play in some archetype, I would say. Next up we have Troublemaker, and 8 mana 6/8 for Warrior. At the end of your turn, summon 2 3/3 Ruffians that attack random enemies. So this card obviously is reminiscent of Priestess of Fury. It's a big chunky body. At the end of your turn, it does some amount of killing of your opponent's minions and face. And basically if it goes unchecked for a turn, it's going to snowball really hard and you're probably just going to win the game. I do think 2 hits of 3 damage is probably a bit less good than 6 1 damage pings. But Troublemaker can leave behind bodies. Like the 3/3 Ruffians that attack can just survive. Especially if they hit the opponent in the face, or they can value trade over 1/1s or whatever. So definitely a very powerful effect. I think there are a lot of decks that would probably just play this card, like Highlander decks or whatever. But I think the main issue is, can Warrior play this card? I don't feel like Enrage Warrior is really interested in just an 8 mana thing. I think they play like 2 cards over 4 mana, so jamming in a couple copies of Troublemaker doesn't really seem reasonable. This is currently the slowest Warrior deck that seems to be in the meta at all, and I don't really know that Troublemaker necessarily just fits in here. Although maybe it replaces the small Kronk's Galakron package, since a lot of times you're just playing Galakron for the 3 damage hero power each turn anyway. Maybe Troublemaker is just better than that in this kind of deck. Or maybe, as we saw earlier with the legendary, it was called like Rattlegore or something. Maybe Dimensional Ripper Warrior is like a real deck this expansion, and I think Troublemaker's pretty insane in that deck. 10 mana, you get 2 6/8s, and at the end of your turn you make 4 3/3s that attack. If that goes unchecked for like 1 turn, you just win the game. So yeah, I certainly think this is a powerful card. It's just a matter of finding a home for it, which I'm not necessarily convinced will happen. But I guess we'll just have to see what the Warrior class gets in this expansion, see if we can push a new archetype. Next up we have First Day of School, a 0 mana Paladin spell that adds 2 random 1-cost minions to your hand. So the comparison I've seen to this card is with Firefly, because, you know, it's 0 mana and you get your 2 1-cost minions, but you can play one of the 1-cost minions the turn you play this. So basically, it's a 1 mana shitty 1-drop that gives you another shitty 1-drop, but it turns out, we've seen with Firefly, that's just a good card. So yeah, I think any Paladin deck that's interested in playing minions is probably pretty happy to play this. And this is specifically just a very good card in Pure Paladin, because it's a Paladin card that's not complete garbage. So maybe this just straight up replaces like Imprisoned Sungill or something? Not really sure. But compared to Imprisoned Sungill, it does give you a 1-drop on turn 1 that you can then curve into Hand of a Doll. So very powerful synergy there. I don't think there's overall that much to say about this card, except it seems like maybe better Firefly, or close enough to Firefly that I expected to see some play. Maybe outside of Pure Paladin, but absolutely in Pure Paladin. Next we have Onyx Magescribe, 6 mana 4/9 dragon, spell burst, add 2 random spells from your class to your hand. So 6 mana 4/9 dragon is pretty chunky, and there are definitely some decks that play dragon synergies right now. But as a 6 mana card, I think the spell burst on this is kind of awkward to use. It's just a very slow card, basically. And if you look at decks that currently have dragon synergy, like Highlander Hunter, really just doesn't have the spells to consistently spell burst this. And even if they are trying to activate Rottnest Drake, I don't think a 6 mana 4/9 dragon is really going to be making the cut in this kind of deck. Similar to Highlander Mage, which is more interested in the value. But it's not super easy to spell burst this, although we have seen a few cards that incentivize us to play more cheap spells in Highlander Mage. So maybe if the deck shifts in that direction, this is a place where the Onyx Magescribe could see some play. Another contender for this would be in Spell Druid, or just some sort of Druid deck that wants to play Breath of Dreams. This archetype obviously has the spells to spell burst the Onyx Magescribe, and currently it's only able to really realistically play 3 dragons for the Breath of Dreams, which is a bit low. But you have to consider that this is also a Fungal Fortunes Glowfly Swarm deck, so every new minion you add really makes those cards worse. So even once we've found an archetype that cares about dragons and could potentially play something like this, has the ramp to play something like this, we're sort of prohibited from playing it because of other synergies in the deck. So I'm not really sure where this card would end up seeing play. It's got a lot going for it, but it's also just extremely slow. And with that in mind, I think it probably won't see too much play. But who knows, maybe some janky Highlander Shaman is desperate for a dragon or something. Finally, we have Frazzled Freshman, 1 mana 1/4 for Priest, no text on it or anything. Well, we've seen that Dire Mole was a good card as a 1 mana 1/3. This is a 1 mana 1/4, so it's got to be better than Dire Mole, right? But it is a Priest-specific card, so we have to wonder if Priest is really going to be able to play this. I don't know that you necessarily play it in, like, Galakron Priest, because you can already play Disciple of Galakron, Cleric of Scales, Imprisoned Homunculus, Psychic Conjurer. Just like Priest, for some reason, already has a ton of 1-drops. And I think for what Priest is trying to do, the 1-drops they already have are probably stronger. But compared to some of those like 1/2s and 1/1s, this card is absolutely insane if you get to land an Apotheosis on it. And not only is it insane if you get to land an Apotheosis on it, it's just really hard to kill to prevent the Apotheosis. So if Apotheosis on curve is important to Priest's game plan going forward, which it very well could be, then I could certainly see Frazzled Freshman seeing play even in something slow, like a Control Galakron Priest. Where I'm personally more interested in playing this is in a more tempo-oriented Priest with like Dragonmaw Overseer. Because +2/+2 on this thing, and suddenly you've got yourself a 3/6. That's pretty nuts. Or maybe if you're playing like Terran Gorefiend in this deck, it's going to come back as a 2/5, which is also very strong. So personally, I'm more interested in playing this in some sort of janky buff tempo Priest. And certainly if a deck like that exists, it's absolutely going to be playing a 1 mana 1/4. But even if we're not getting too crazy and just sticking to a Priest archetype that already exists, I think this card actually could see some play.